Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Monday, April 1st, 2024. All right, first, I hope everyone had a good weekend. Happy Easter. For those who celebrate, we had a nice weekend, had a good Easter morning today with the family. I wish I had some good news that I could deliver today, but unfortunately, it's all pretty bad as usual. So the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, Israel creates kill zones in the Gaza Strip. So Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, reported on Sunday that Israel has been creating kill zones in the Gaza Strip in areas where the Israeli military is operating. And the way these zones work is that anyone who enters will get shot, even if they are unarmed. The report said that anyone killed in a designated kill zone is labeled a terrorist, even if they never held a gun in their lives. And it also said that they are often civilians whose only crime was to cross an invisible line drawn by the IDF. One Israeli reservist who was recently in North Gaza said, quote, "The feeling we had was that there weren't really rules of engagement there," end quote. Other sources in the IDF told Haaretz that Israel's claim that 9,000 out of the 32,000 Palestinians killed in Gaza, and we know that 32,000 is a low estimate, but Israel's claiming that they killed 9,000 terrorists, but these IDF sources say that that is not a valid claim. One Israeli reserve officer said, quote, "In practice, a terrorist is anyone the IDF has killed in the areas in which its forces operate," end quote. A senior officer in Israel's Southern Command said, quote, "It was astonishing to hear the reports after every operation regarding how many terrorists were killed. You don't need to be a genius to realize that you don't have hundreds or dozens of armed men running through the streets of Khan Yunis or Jabalia fighting the IDF," end quote. So essentially what he's saying is that Hamas, they're not fighting in big groups. It's just a few at a time that they usually engage with. And another reserve officer who spoke with Haaretz said that he was tasked with telling senior IDF officers how many quote-unquote terrorists were killed in operations that his men carried out. And he said, quote, "No one can determine with certainty who is a terrorist and who was hit after entering the combat zone of an IDF force," end quote. So we got a glimpse of what this policy looks like when Al Jazeera published that video of an Israeli drone killing 4 unarmed men. The video shows the men walking in an open area of Khan Yunis when a drone strike hits them. If you remember this really brutal video, so they drone strike 4 men who were walking clearly unarmed. 2 of them were killed instantly, and the other 2 were finished off with a 3rd and 4th drone strike. And the last man, you see him actually trying to limp away, and then he collapses and tries to crawl away as the missile hits him. I mean, it's really brutal stuff. And according to this report from Haaretz, this was one of those so-called kill zones, and a senior IDF officer confirmed to Haaretz that the 4 men were unarmed and that they did not endanger the Israeli forces in the area in which they were walking. So confirmation from Israeli media that that they were not armed and were not a threat, yet they were taken out like that anyway. The Haaretz report also said that, if you remember back in December, Israeli troops in Gaza gunned down 3 Israeli hostages who were shirtless, and one of them was waving a white flag. Gunned them down, killed them, even when they were yelling out in Hebrew. And apparently that was also the result of one of these kill zones. So basically, this really reveals a lot, I think, because you have Israel claiming that they've killed 9,000 members of Hamas, and this is saying, well, really, we don't know. Really, we have no idea what the true toll is, because they're counting everyone they kill in these areas as terrorists or whatever. So I think this is just such an important story, especially when we get into the next thing here, because the next story The U.S. approves billions in more bombs and fighter jets for Israel. So the reason why, obviously I'm connecting these two stories because, if that's being reported in Haaretz, that means the U.S. knows that. They know that Israel is indiscriminately killing Palestinians in these kill zones. The U.S. knows exactly what's happening in Gaza. And they're still doing this. So the Biden administration has approved billions of dollars worth of bombs and fighter jets for Israel to support the slaughter and starvation of Palestinians in Gaza, despite claims from U.S. officials that they are concerned about the massive civilian casualty rate. Excuse me. U.S. officials told the Washington Post that the administration approved the transfer of 500 Mk-82 500-pound bombs and more than 1,800 Mk-84 2,000-pound bombs. These are huge bombs, and Israel has used them to level entire city blocks and just is dropping them on civilian areas, and they're still sending them over. The administration has also approved the transfer of 25 F-35 fighter jets to Israel, a deal worth $2.5 billion, and this is likely being paid for by U.S. military aid to Israel. I know last year when they started moving this deal along, it said that it was being paid for with what they call the foreign military financing. Israel gets $3.3 billion of that each year from the U.S., and that's money the U.S. gives to foreign governments for them to buy American-made weapons. So U.S. officials said that both of these transfers, both the bombs and the fighter jets, they're saying they've already been approved by Congress, and that this is just fulfilling those deals. So Congress was not notified. This wasn't made public. I mean, this is U.S. officials revealed it to media outlets, but there was no announcement from the Biden administration. They're trying to do this all under the table, keep it out of the public eye to avoid scrutiny. And a White House official confirmed to the Post that the U.S. military aid to Israel is still unconditional. The official said conditioning aid has not been U.S. policy. And news of the weapons transfers came after Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant visited Washington to ensure continued U.S. support for Israel's brutal campaign. While President Biden and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu appear to be at odds in public, behind the scenes, U.S. support for Israel continues unabated. And that's an important point here because we keep seeing this narrative that Biden and all these other Democrats are so mad at Netanyahu that the reason why this is such a mess and being dragged out is because of Netanyahu. But realistically, nothing has changed when it comes to the U.S. support for Israel. So the death toll, the numbers from Gaza's health ministry on Sunday, they said 32,782 Palestinians have been killed and 75,298 have been wounded. And this is a low estimate. The total does not include the thousands of people who are estimated to be trapped under the rubble. The New York Times had an article the other day that said it was a few months ago, 7,000 people were missing, presumed dead, and that number has increased probably quite a bit. And also that number includes, the 32,000 includes over 13,000 children. And again, that's also probably on the low end. So as this, I mean, there's a lot to say about the U.S. sending these bombs and fighter jets. It's just unbelievable. I mean, unfortunately, it's not unbelievable, but it's just really despicable, I should say. All right, the next one here. A U.S. congressman says to destroy Gaza like Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So Representative Tim Walberg, a Republican from Michigan, has come under fire for saying that Gaza should be handled like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, suggesting that they should be nuked, suggesting that nuclear bombs should be dropped on the Gaza Strip, which, of course, could kill millions of Palestinians. So Walberg made the comments at a town hall last week when he was asked about the U.S. funding the construction of a port in Gaza. He said, quote, "We shouldn't be spending a dime on humanitarian aid. It should be like Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Get it over quick." End quote. So these comments, these genocidal comments from Walberg, became public when they surfaced in a video on social media over the weekend. And in response to the controversy, Walberg claimed that he was using a metaphor So he's claiming that he used a metaphor. I mean, what kind of metaphor is that to compare Gaza to the two cities where the U.S. dropped nuclear bombs? I mean, it's completely it's a joke for him to say that. We know what he meant. But I'll read what his response was. He said, quote, "I use the metaphor to convey the need for both Israel and Ukraine to win their wars as swiftly as possible without putting American troops in harm's way. My reasoning was the exact opposite of what is being reported. The quicker these wars end, the fewer innocent lives will be caught in the crossfire," end quote. Well, if he means dropping a nuke, I guess he doesn't consider Palestinian civilians to be innocent, which I'm sure that's the view of many people in Congress. And Israeli officials have frequently pointed to the U.S. and allied bombing of Germany and Japan during World War II to justify the mass killing of civilians in Gaza. Military historians say the destruction in Gaza is on par with the destruction of German cities like Dresden. And these are some of the most heavily bombed places in history. So that's the scale of destruction here. So Wahlberg came under a lot of criticism, of course, for what he said, including from fellow Michigan politicians, including Justin Amash, who's a former House representative. I believe he's running for Senate now, but he's a Republican, and he lost family. He's a Palestinian American, and he lost family members when Israel bombed the Greek Orthodox Church in Gaza. So Amash said that Wahlberg's comments, quote, "evince an utter indifference to human suffering. The people of Gaza are our fellow human beings, many of them children, trapped in horrific circumstances beyond their individual control. For him to suggest that hundreds of thousands of innocent Palestinians should be obliterated, including my own relatives sheltering at an Orthodox Christian church, is reprehensible and indefensible," end quote. All right, so the next one here, pro-Palestinian protests disrupt a major Biden campaign event. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone. He wrote this up on Friday. It says pro-Palestinian activists surrounded the Radio City Music Hall in New York City as President Joe Biden hosted one of his most prominent campaign events featuring his two Democratic predecessors. Inside the hall, protesters disrupted the speeches, criticizing Biden's unyielding support for Israel. So, in footage from the venue, a female protester interrupts the president, shouting, quote, "Shame on you, Joe Biden. You are funding genocide in Palestine," end quote. And she was forcibly removed from the theater. And then there was at least two other instances of protesters denouncing, shouting out and about what is happening in Gaza. And then outside, there were protesters outside of Radio City Music Hall I saw the video of them chanting, "Genocide Joe has got to go." So we're going to keep seeing this around these fundraiser and campaign events. And, hopefully this pressure does something. But as you can see from the story about him signing off on more bombs and jets for Israel, doesn't seem to be phasing him at this point. All right, so the next one here, the State Department says that parts of Gaza are experiencing famine. So this is another article from Kyle. A State Department official said that there is a significant risk of mass starvation throughout Gaza, and some regions of the Strip are quite possibly already in a state of famine. Millions of Palestinians are on the brink of starvation as a result of Israel's brutal 6-month military assault and blockade on aid entering the Strip. So speaking with Reuters, an unnamed State Department official said, quote, "While we can say with confidence that famine is a significant risk in the south and center, but not present in the north, it is both a risk and quite possibly is present in at least some areas," end quote. So here you have a U.S. official acknowledging that famine could already be happening in Gaza. And again, and they're still supporting. The Biden administration just signed off on Israel's so-called assurances that they're not breaking international or American U.S. law which is just a complete joke. The big law that is being cited by Democrats who want the U.S. to cut off military aid to Israel is the foreign assistance law that says a country that blocks U.S. aid shipments cannot use or receive U.S. military aid. And it's clear that they're doing that, yet they still signed off on those assurances. And it's clear that they're killing civilians, yet they still signed off on those assurances. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. loosens sanctions on violent Israeli settlers. This article is from Will Porter. It says the Biden administration has clarified a new round of sanctions targeting violent Israeli settlers in the occupied West Bank, saying it would allow local banks to process routine transactions with people on the blacklist. The U.S. Treasury Department elaborated on the penalties in a letter to Tel Aviv's central bank, which reported, so it said the message was intended to cool anger over the sanctions by the country's finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich. So apparently, the U.S. sanctioned a few settlers in the West Bank over all this violence and killing of Palestinians in the West Bank and taking of their land and stealing their homes. And a number of Israeli banks froze the assets, froze the accounts of the people that were under sanctions. And this is the U.S. saying, no, you could still let them, use their bank accounts and everything. And what this is a response to Smotrich, the Israeli finance minister, who's also a minister basically in charge of the West Bank. And he's a settler himself who has long been clear about his desire for Israel to conquer the West Bank. And he was threatening to take all the Palestinian banks in the West Bank to freeze them, put them under sanctions, get them kicked out of the global banking system, which could really hurt the Palestinian economy. So this is the U.S. responding to that and saying, no, don't actually freeze their bank accounts or anything. All right, so the next one here, dozens killed in new Gaza strikes amid reports of talks. So this article is from the New Arab, and it's just about, this was Saturday into Sunday, the Israeli airstrikes and bombardment and ground attacks continued, and Gaza's health ministry said that at least 75 people were killed in those overnight attacks, and they said most of them were women and children. Gaza's government media office also said that over 400 people, including medical staff, patients, and displaced people, had been killed in a 13-day siege of the Al-Shifa medical complex in Gaza City. That's the hospital, the big hospital in Gaza City. It added that Israeli forces were detaining 107 people, including 30 patients and 61 medical workers in inhumane conditions on the hospital grounds. All right, so the next one here, Israel's High Court says the government must stop funding seminaries. So this article is from AP, and there's been this a lot of drama going on within the Israeli government over this law, over this Supreme Court ruling in Israel that will curtail subsidies for ultra-Orthodox men. And basically, it's the fact that there is an exemption when it comes to the draft, when it comes to military conscription for ultra-Orthodox who study at these yeshivas, they're called. And the Supreme Court is ruling because they're not, what's the word I'm looking for, drafted or conscripted. They don't have that obligation, then they shouldn't get the government subsidies. And the plan, the ultra-Orthodox lawmakers within Netanyahu's governing coalition, and he depends on their support for the government to be held together. This seems to be a threat on his governing coalition. So Netanyahu has until Monday to present the court with a plan to dismantle what the justices called a system that privileges the ultra-Orthodox at the expense of the secular Jewish public. If that plan alienates the ultra-Orthodox lawmakers on whose support he depends, his coalition could disintegrate and the country could be forced to hold new elections. And they just get into the decision. So most Jewish men are required to serve nearly 3 years in the military, followed by years of reserve duty. Jewish women serve 2 mandatory years, but the politically powerful ultra-Orthodox, who make up roughly 13% of Israeli society, have traditionally received exemptions while studying full-time in religious seminaries or yeshivas. The years-old system has bred widespread resentment among the broader public, a feeling that has deepened since October 7th. So the Supreme Court ruled that the current system is discriminatory and gave the government until Monday to present a new plan and until June 30th to pass one, to make something into law. Netanyahu asked the court Thursday for a 30-day extension to find a compromise. So we'll see what happens here. So it looks like Netanyahu has to show the court a plan that is satisfactory to them about this issue. And if his plan that he comes up with angers the Orthodox in his government, it could threaten to dissolve. They could threaten to dissolve it, and that would mean elections. So that's not what Netanyahu wants, obviously. All right, so the next one here, death toll in Israeli airstrikes on Syria rise to 52. So this article is from Jason Ditz. So Syria's Aleppo province saw the deadliest Israeli attacks in years on Friday when Israeli warplanes hit multiple targets in the Aleppo countryside and targeted a Hezbollah warehouse near Aleppo's airport. The warehouse reportedly housed rockets, and the attack resulted in a series of explosions. As of Saturday, at least 52 people were reported killed in the Israeli attacks, 38 of them Syrian soldiers, 7 pro-Iranian forces, and 7 members of Hezbollah. I assume when they say pro-Iranian, that means like the Shia militias. The toll may yet rise further, however, as civilians were also reported slain and still do not appear in the final count. Dozens were also reported wounded. So Israel has not taken credit for the attack. They declined to comment on it, but this is their MO for their airstrikes in Syria. There's no doubt, there's very little doubt, if there's any, that this was Israel. And they also claimed the same day some airstrikes in Lebanon. And the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, he basically hinted at Israeli responsibility, saying that there might be more what he called successful termination, like the one that was executed this morning. And he said that on Friday. So we've seen Israel frequently bomb Syria. It's something they've done for years, but it really ramped up since October 7th. And these are, compared to their airstrikes over the years, these are pretty huge for Israeli airstrikes in Syria, killing that many people. And recently I went over the fact that they killed another member of Iran's IRGC. And of course, that risks war with Iran. All right, so the next one here, 8 killed and 30 wounded in an overnight market blast in northern Syria. This is another one from Jason. And this was Saturday into Sunday. An overnight car blast tore through a crowded market in the rebel-held northern Syrian city of Azaz, killing at least 8 people and wounding some 30 others. 2 children were reported among the fatalities. The market was unusually busy that night because of the holy month of Ramadan, and shoppers were flocking to the marketplace to buy clothing for their children for the upcoming Eid al-Fitr celebration. As ambulances and rescue workers flocked to the scene, the crowd was in near panic, fearing a second explosion, as many bombing plots strike a second time during the chaos. So Azaz is north of Aleppo, near the Turkish border, and it's controlled by these Turkish-backed militant groups. And not far away to the south is Idlib, which is controlled by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is Al-Qaeda, basically. And it's not clear who was responsible for this car bombing. There's immediate suspects are either ISIS or a Kurdish faction, potentially. These are Kurds have fought with these Turkish-backed groups, and there's just all sorts of potential culprits. Al-Qaeda, whether it's Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or there's also Haras al-Din. They're another Al-Qaeda offshoot that operate in northern Syria. So lots of violence in Syria happening. All right, so the next one here, the UN investigates 4 peacekeepers who were wounded in Lebanon. Another article here from Jason. The United Nations has announced it is launching an investigation into Saturday's incident. So there's an explosion in southern Lebanon. It injured 4 personnel, 4 UN peacekeepers. And the early reports said that there was a drone strike that hit them, and that obviously points to Apparently Israel denied it. A lot of times you see when civilians are killed or hurt in Lebanon, Israel will just say, "Oh no, we killed terrorists." They'll just kind of deny it that way. But in this sense, they denied that they attacked the vehicle. But I think I have a strong hunch that it was, Israel, because they've been bombing South Lebanon so much, and they've been killing a lot of civilians. All right, so the last story here, the U.S., Japan, and the Philippines to launch joint patrols in the South China Sea. So the U.S., Japan, and the Philippines will launch joint patrols in the South China Sea later this year in a move that is sure to escalate tensions with China. According to Politico, the joint patrols will be announced in April when President Biden will host Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida and Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. They're holding their first ever trilateral summit. So this is an example of the U.S. has been working to really bolster and strengthen its alliances with Japan and the Philippines as part of its strategy to prepare for a future war with China. And it has also been encouraging these countries to form their own military ties. And this is a big part of the plan when we talk about the U.S. military buildup in Asia, in the Asia Pacific. A big part of it is getting U.S. allies to cooperate, to form these anti-China alliances. Last year, the U.S., Japan, and the Philippines held their first trilateral maritime exercise in the South China Sea. So when we talk about joint patrols, this is different than just doing the exercises. Of course, the exercises are very provocative too, because that usually involves live fire, missile drills, and things like that. But the patrols, it's basically just them kind of sailing around. And, when they do military drills, they where they're going to do them. When it comes to these patrols, it seems like they could go all over. And that, of course, increases the risk of an encounter with any Chinese ships. And there's been a lot of tense encounters that sometimes end in collision between Chinese and Philippine Coast Guard boats. So this is just adding to the risk of some sort of incident happening. And the South China Sea is pretty tense right now. And whenever the Chinese and the Philippine, whenever they have any kind of encounter in the South China Sea, the U.S. is always there to say, hey, to remind China that the Mutual Defense Treaty applies to attacks on Philippine boats in the South China Sea. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from Ramsey Baroud, Complicit in Genocide, Where Israel Gets Its Weapons From. One from John V. Walsh, How to Stop the $95 billion War Bill. So he has another one here about this discharge petition, which if this discharge petition, the point of it is to go around House Speaker Johnson to force the House to vote on the $95 billion foreign military aid bill. The discharge petition to do that needs 218 votes. It needs 218 signatures. Right now it has 192, and 191 of those signatures come from Democrats. So he wants, if you have a Democratic representative in the House, find out, you could find the names of the 22 who didn't sign it in John's first article about this. And it's mostly progressives because they're against the new aid for Israel that's in there. So if you're a Democrat, if you have a Democratic rep, look them up, see whether or not they signed the petition. And if they signed it, you could call their office and say, hey, remove your signature for this reason. And if they didn't sign it, you can call them and say, hey, good job not signing that thing, and encourage the ones who didn't sign it so they don't cave to the pressure. All right, one from Ted Snyder, How many Westerners are fighting in Ukraine? One from Brad Pierce, In Defense of Inaction. He's talking about how the U.S. should not intervene in Haiti. The Spotlight is from James Banford, The Nuclear Explosion That Makes U.S. Aid to Israel Illegal. So please go check all of that out. You could always support the show by sharing, like, subscribe, all that stuff. Tell your friends about antiwar.com. Comment, and that stuff really helps out. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter. And again, I hope everyone had a nice weekend. I'll be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.